Greetings, my friends! Today we will talk about the historical sword known as the Messer. Is it a good sword or a bad sword? Or is it maybe a very good knife? Let's find out. The Messer, as the name implies, had Germanic origins. In the Middle Ages, it could commonly be encountered in the areas known today as Switzerland, Austria, southern Germany. Now, if you're an English speaker, Messer may sound intimidating. Indeed, it sounds as if it is named after its ability to mess somebody up. But if you're a German, then it simply means knife. And indeed, this thing was designed to be a big, long knife. That's why it was also known as Langes Messer, Große Messer, or any other type of Messer which is bigger than a normal knife. But why would you make such a very big knife instead of a proper sword? Well, the reason was legislation, or you could say medieval gun control. You see, in a lot of very developed and very affluent South German cities, it was forbidden for commoners to bear swords. That was a duty and a privilege of the knights, who were expected to act according to standards of honor and decency, and were in a sense also responsible for a degree of policing. However, the Middle Ages were pretty brutal times. Life was tough, and this is why a commoner often needed a self-defense tool. Cities had crime, and especially being defenseless in a city or unarmed was not without its dangers. So clever German commoners came up with a solution. Since they were allowed to carry a knife for their everyday jobs, or use the fact that they work as an excuse to have some kind of knife, they started progressively making those knives bigger and bigger, until you ended up with this type of knife, which was called a knife, but it was all but a knife. You could say it was a big knife or a small sword, but it was a sword, let's be honest. So today we're going to talk about the Messer. Was it a good sword or was it a bad sword? As a measure of comparison for the Messer, we're going to use the arming sword. Or in other words, just the standard medieval sword. One obvious first advantage one can notice between the Messer and the arming sword is that the arming sword is simply longer, which means that it can reach somebody from further away. Reach is a pretty big advantage. Of course, you would ask, couldn't they make the Messer any longer? The answer is, theoretically they could, and in fact they did. There were versions of the Messer which were longer and heavier. Even two-handed, huge versions used for war by professional soldiers though. But those would be unlikely to pass for a knife as an excuse when somebody was checked or controlled in a city by some figure of authority like a knight. So they were making the knife long as they could, but they were staying within some reasonable limits, because after a point it would be really hard to convince anybody that this, it's a knife, it's not a sword. The other obvious advantage that an arming sword has compared to a Messer is that the arming sword is double-edged. That means that you can do reverse strikes. You cannot do reverse strikes with a Messer, or you can do them, but it's not gonna cut, because it only has an edge on one side, which is the one facing forward, or the true edge. That being said, the katana also has one edge, and as we all know, is the best sword ever made, so there's that. However, it's not all negatives compared to the arming sword. The Messer usually had some kind of device for protecting the hand, which is very handy. The device could be a simple guard such as this, which personally I like the most. It could also be a ring, which was maybe easier to construct. Whatever the case, let me explain the functionality of this and how it actually improves sword fighting. When you fight with a sword, one of the most obvious targets is the hand. The hand actually is extending further out from the body, so it's faster and easier to reach for the opponent. And if the hand gets debilitated, then guess what? You cannot use the sword anymore, so the fight is already over. That makes the hands, both in historical context and also in competition context today, a very good target, which is very often chosen, let me tell you. When you're holding an arming sword like that and somebody aims at your hand, the only option you have if you're not in position to engage his blade with your blade is to turn your crossguard sideways so that the strike ends up caught by the crossguard. If you don't do that, then the sword would cut your hand. The Messer, having this clever device, allows you to stay in the same position and parry an attack to the hand without moving the crossguard at all. What that means is that you don't need to change the blade's alignment, so if you were in the middle of an attack or initiating an attack at the time, you don't need to abort that, parry and then attack. You can keep going, just make sure that the hand attack you're receiving is gonna strike exactly on the guard. And this way you can just keep attacking. That's a very clever device and a very good advantage that the Messer offers. Now, we talked before about how the arming sword is actually longer and how that's an advantage. But it's not only an advantage. In some cases, you want the weapon you have to be shorter. Think about the Spartans, for example. The Spartans had shorter swords compared to the rest of the Greeks. The reason for that is that they were superior wrestlers, and when you come really close with somebody, the extra length is actually not an advantage anymore, it becomes a hindrance. So the Messers appear in the training manuscripts somewhere in the 13th century, which means that they were in existence long before that, and they were proliferated enough to become a commonly trained weapon. And almost always, you see Messer manuals including wrestling or ringen or Kampfringen techniques, or the other way around. Wrestling or Kampfringen manuals including Messer techniques. The reason for that is that those two are very well combined, and indeed, when your weapon is so short, that means that you will have to come within short range to use it. And short range or close range is grappling range. All sorts of grappling techniques are open once you are right next to the other person. So what else is so special about the Messer? Well, one very obvious thing is the handle. The handle, or the grip, is made of wood, and it's made in the same way that the knives' handles are made. This is both beautiful and aids in the illusion that this is actually a knife, police officer, and not really a sword. But the way they made them, they were pretty big, a lot bigger than the handle of an arming sword. And the obvious reason why they made them this way is that they could at any time be used with two hands if needed. Now, one thing that you understand if you've ever done any longsword is that the longsword generates a lot more force than a single-handed sword. And the reason for that is that the force of the single-handed sword is generated by simply the use of one arm and the momentum of its weight. While in the longsword, even if it had the same dimensions, except for the handle obviously, compared to the one-handed sword, it would generate still a lot more force simply because it becomes a lever. The lever action is what makes the two-handed sword very powerful compared to a one-handed sword, more so than the weight or anything else. So what this effectively means is that the Messer could become a two-handed sword in a bind, thus take the line, and after you take the line, your opponent is wide open for a thrust or a cut without being able to oppose you as much as if the line was contested. Another final advantage that we could think of regarding the Messer is that its smaller size and length means that it's got a greater concealability, and it's also easier to carry for everyday life, which is a pretty big deal if you're a commoner in a city, which means that you've got work to do. You're not just walking around and wasting your time. People back then had to work in order to survive, and they had to work a lot, all day. And that means that the Messer is a good companion to not hinder you and also not draw unnecessary attention, be it from authorities or from other people who may want what you have, such as your nice, shiny, long knife, so the Messer wins there. So overall, is the Messer simply a bad sword? The short answer is kind of yes. In a straight-up sword fight, the arming sword wielder would have an obvious advantage due to the greater length and also the fact that the arming sword is more designed for the specific reason of sword fighting, which means it's got a pommel to increase the weight that it's got on the back, and thus increasing its mobility and its nimbleness, which in turn also means that they can make this thing heavier and so a more powerful cutter without losing or sacrificing any of its mobility. While the Messer does not have a metal pommel, which means that it's going to be a little more front heavy, so if you want to make it light and nimble, you will need to make the blade not very substantial, which decreases its cutting force and also its nimbleness. But the Messer was not made to be used in battle. Indeed, as a short-range civilian self-defense weapon, which may need to be deployed at any time by anybody who is going about his business, the Messer offers a lot of advantages. It is shorter, it is generally lighter, it is more easily concealable, and it is cheaper. Its hand protection is a cleverly implemented defense feature, and the fact that it can be wielded with two hands at any time increases its versatility by an awful lot. So you could say that the Messer is a poor sword, but an amazingly good knife. So if you want to see more videos of this type regarding also other medieval weapons, just let me know in the comments and I will see what I can do. Until the next time, thanks for watching and have a very nice day. And stay clear of medieval looking German cities, unless you can quickly produce something like this out of your underwear.